Welcome to Resilient, Reusable, and Fun CI with Buildkite. Allow us to introduce ourselves and our team. This is the Wayfair open source program office, showed in our preferred form emojis. I'm Gary White. I've been working with Wayfair for about 3 years, and you can see us up in the corner as well.
I am Lelia Bray-Musso, and I'm just here for a good time. Well, okay, I'm also here to spread the word about open source and Buildkite, and I've been doing so for about 2 years. Well, you can see there's also some folks not on the talk or not paying attention to this talk.
Oh, yeah.
Gary.
Right. Yep.
Right.
Dan Rowe's here too. Yep. Seen for his buffalo tuna. You can see our resident spooky witch, Natalie Blackco. She's also our team leader. And John Hodges, who prefers to express his true inner self through the cat Thurston Waffles. Wayfair has done some great open source work with Buildkite relevant to our open source program office team, but that's not why Lelia and I are qualified to talk about it here at UnblockConf. Lelia and I are here because of our experience on the test enablement team at Wayfair. We were brought in by Jay Farron, here immortalized in his emoji. He moved on to a different company. Test enablement started in late 2018, and we spent the majority of our effort beefing up the CI platform for Wayfair with Buildkite. Through that time, we went through an unstable and unmanageable mess of tools to a much more cohesive ecosystem, and we had Buildkite to thank for much of that. We'll be using our time in this talk to recount some of our best changes and examples without disparaging the folks that came before us. Because we love Buildkite and we appreciate the work that we've done, but we keep our eyes open to the idea that we might be making mistakes as big as the ones that led us to change when we did and use Buildkite. So to avoid the possibility that we make a mistake, we try to identify what we do around opportunities for improvement and a couple of themes. So here you can see the themes for developer leverage and user experience.
Gary, you gonna let me say my lines, or are you just gonna do the whole presentation?
Sorry, go ahead. Yep.
Thank you. As I was saying, we'll see developer leverage and user experience as something worth improving first. When our Wayfarians feel empowered to make changes and make them quickly with minimal effort, we've done our job as a platform team. Next, we care about code reusability. If one team can do something well, we'd love to have them share that experience with the rest of their organization. Third, we care about something that ideally our users won't even think about. If we have resilient infrastructure, our time is spent making new features and learning from them, not on keeping the Buildkite agents running. Now that we've reviewed the themes, let's get into the tales. Gary, take it away.
Alrighty. Let's start by talking about everybody's favorite exciting thing, infrastructure. Not too long ago, Wayfair CI infrastructure was in a situation that I'm sure most of us will be familiar with. If you've ever heard the term snowflake infrastructure or pet machines, that's exactly what we were doing for our build infrastructure. We had a lot of machines that were fully unique and bespoke in their setup and maintenance, and as a result, teams would regularly have to maintain their own infrastructure, or they would just try to use a machine that they didn't know much about. In a world where every team dedicated resources to maintaining their own runners, that probably would have worked, but for us at Wayfair, we had some teams that would reasonably expect that there would be an infrastructure platform available to them so they could focus on application development. Instead, we had a lot of chaos and confusion as machines ran scarce, builds would take longer and longer, and at one point, the entire build infrastructure depended on 2 virtual machines that nobody knew about, at least nobody still with the company.
What could possibly go wrong, Gary?
A lot of things, Lelia. A lot of things went wrong. And if we reflect on our themes, we can tie it to the solution not being resilient. It's certainly not reusable because we couldn't make more, and our developers were not having fun trying to use it. So moving on to Buildkite, we had centralized the keys to build machines with our team. We could create a more consistent developer experience in different languages using different tools, but I want to show an example using one tool that everybody's probably familiar with, saying, I'll keep things simple by tracking the experience of using a container at Wayfair before and after we went to Buildkite. So on the right, you'll see that I have a little container job, and it's looking for somewhere to run. If you're a developer or an automated system, you may get a list like this, and you would get reasonably confused because engineering teams set these up and they make sense to those teams, but the names don't really give much away. So I could guess picking Java Container Kafka, for example, might be able to run my job. And it turns out, as we try to run our job, the machine is running a Kafka container and has Java installed, obviously, because the name is Java Container Kafka. It just so happens that the container daemon is not available to the build environment for security reasons. That's something that we only learned by trying and failing and talking to the team about it. So let's go back to the list and try again. Remember that we're stepping through these guesses manually, but you could just as easily automate this. Since I don't see container anywhere else in the list, I'm just going to gamble on a strangely named instance. So let's pick Gary's machine. We'll try Gary's machine.
Ooh, Gary's machine. Is that the one that deploys your custom emojis to Slack?
It sure is, Lelia. I do it all through that one.
Nice.
So we're in luck this time. Gary must have had the right dependencies installed, and we can run successfully on the machine. And we run our job a few times, and we decide that Gary's machine is reliable. And
so funny. It's totally unlike Gary the person.
okay, Lelia, I was looking at my phone for like a second. It was a phone. It was from
this
you.
This is why millennials have the reputation we do. Just
Okay.
saying.
All right. We're not getting into that. As time goes on, the builds stop working. And so what do we do now? We call Gary. I mean, he probably doesn't know that we're running jobs on the machine. It may not shift things around for us. So we're back to the list again. Trying to decide what box to try to run our jobs, test our code, whatever we might need to do. So we decided, going to Buildkite, instead of letting developers struggle with this, we wanted it to be smoother. In Buildkite, you can we specified queues through the Buildkite API to designate which machines did what. So for example, we could have a fleet of machines that run Java and not require developers to be intimately familiar with our infrastructure to use them effectively. You just provide some docs and a guide, and most engineers intuitively find what queue they want by checking the available queues. And almost all the time, the name of the queue negates the need for our engineers to think about the infrastructure. Developers get confident, and they get so confident in the queue model that they don't try to target machines directly at all. And that's fantastic for us maintaining infrastructure because we can make changes without interrupting service. Maintenance events, outages, and auto scaling are much easier with this abstraction than it is to have folks targeting specific machines or things that might be special purpose for their needs. So it's also worth noting in this transition that operationalization is much easier when you use configuration management tools. And that was a dense sentence, so let me be more specific. Namely, Terraform and Puppet as configuration management tools to spin up and spin down these machines makes our installations replicable and replaceable. So to recap our themes there, switching to using Buildkite queues makes the developer experience better, allowing them to do more with less and have more fun. The management tools for our infrastructure make our infrastructure and our installation as a result more reusable and resilient. But one part that still stood out was the ability to reuse and have a resilient pipeline specification. So I want to hand off to Lelia to learn more about that.
Thanks, Gary. Now let's travel back in time a little bit, where we're going to meet our next protagonist. Many, many moons ago, there was an engineer interested in improving the state of her pipeline by targeting a more reliable build agent. So she heads over to the monorepo where she intends to make the change in search of the CI pipeline config. Now, she finds the YAML easily enough, it's in the repo root, but she's immediately horrified by what she finds. The pipeline looked something like this.
Oh my god.
Yeah, I know. It's bad. Yeah, so not only was it unwieldy to the point of being nearly indecipherable, it was also the single orchestration layer responsible for building a critical production asset. Too wary to make a change on her own, at risk disrupting dozens of deployments, our engineer instead approached the maintainers of the pipeline, humbly requesting access to their bountiful tribal knowledge. And, a bit reluctant at first, but the maintainers eventually did give our engineer access to make those necessary changes. But then why did the pipeline have to be so unwieldy in the first place? What if we could actually break up that gigantic YAML monstrosity into smaller, digestible chunks with clear separation of domain and ownership? Well, good news for us. After Wayfair chose Buildkite as their CI platform, we learned very quickly that their built-in support for dynamic pipelines actually already made this possible. See, Buildkite agents typically expect to receive pipeline instructions in YAML, but you can supercharge your everyday pipeline.yaml file by converting it to a pipeline.sh script. This, in turn, can concatenate multiple chunks of YAML based on environment variables, build conditions, or even context from a commit diff. To the unsuspecting user, this all magically appears in the Buildkite UI as a unified pipeline, as depicted above. Now, it is important to note that dynamic pipelines are a feature that lets us make decisions about where the pipeline is going during the runtime of the pipeline. From there, a pipeline.sh script is a utility which helps us achieve that goal. So, using dynamic pipelines, our platform teams were able to define a highly reusable pattern for engineers building moderately complex pipelines. And because dynamic pipelines provide much more flexibility and modularity, they were easy to share across teams and allow neighboring engineers to pick and choose the useful stuff that their team needed and skip the rest. Beyond the ability to programmatically stitch together pipeline steps on the fly, dynamic pipelines also provided a way to really unleash the power of YAML templating and dry, or don't repeat yourself, principles. By combining YAML templates with the notion of a common .yaml file, which is read in by pipeline.sh before any steps are called, we could actually store required environment variables and build configurations for multiple steps, which needed to be extracted by many of the same values over and over again. This also made it much easier to propagate a single change, like a version tag, an image name, or an agent queue specification across numerous pipeline steps. Now, speaking of scripted pipelines, let's harken back once more and fondly recall not only the halcyon days of never-ending YAML, but so too those ethereal shell scripts we used to hack together anytime we faced, a moderate challenge with our build pipelines. More often than not, these shell scripts would call a secondary script, which in turn called another script, and so on and so forth. And yeah, we learned pretty quickly that layers of abstraction are best consumed in moderation here. Not only were these shell scripts extremely difficult to troubleshoot, they were even harder to discover or share with others. Often undocumented, almost never versioned, these bespoke collections of scripts would tend to sit around and slowly atrophy in their respective repositories, tragically unaware of how much they had in common with their neighbors. If only there was a better way. Oh, okay. Yeah, as you probably guessed by now, there was one. Buildkite plugins. And don't get me wrong, plugins aren't exactly a new concept in CI, but we do think that the way Buildkite in particular does plugins is pretty nifty. At their core, and somewhat ironically, they're really just fancy shell scripts, but they're much more powerful than the ones you normally encounter in CI. Since Buildkite plugins all begin with a shell script entry point, there is near guarantee that your plugin will run on any CI agent it is deployed onto. Of course, if you do wish to leverage higher level languages, you can do that too, so long as the agent you're running it on has the necessary dependencies to support it. Using plugins, it allows us to centralize and track commonly requested pipeline functionality, version it, and create an easy path for anyone to improve and extend the plugin as needed. Additional parameters are simple to integrate, and they create a documentation trail on how those changes happened. Okay, so before I hand it back over to Gary, here's a quick plug for some of the Buildkite plugins that we use on a regular basis. And here's a snapshot of some of the plugins we've not only built and open sourced ourselves, but we've also forked and contributed to upstream. And next up, Gary is going to talk more about some of these plugins, some agent hooks, and other innovative solutions that we've built for Buildkite since making it part of the Wayfair tech ecosystem.
All right. Thanks again, Lelia. It's funny to be saying this next bit from inside the open source program office, but a lot of customizations we've done for Wayfair have been done internally, outside of open source, outside of the public eye. For anyone working at a sufficiently large company, I'm sure that is not surprising. There are plenty of things that would compromise company secrets or security to leave in the open, and configuration for how people interact with a prod system is not different. For Wayfair, we have had a couple of technical needs from or a couple of typical needs from our CI platform, including securing sensitive secrets like API tokens and file config for internal services. We needed a secure way to run plugins so that privileged machines that can deploy to our environments aren't compromised by arbitrary code. And finally, one of the more beefy problems is dealing with containers, like just all of the things that go into containers. How do you store them? How do you run them? And how do you make sure they work consistently with what people would expect from a virtual machine? We accomplish much of this with clever use of hooks installed on our agents, as well as plugins, and as you might expect, plenty of shell scripts. Let's get right to it, starting with our encryption and decryption solutions. Behold, a Wayfair internal script out on the internet.
No.
Yeah, it's not, you can tell the image copy doesn't have sensitive info in it. I cropped it intentionally, and while you can't see anything juicy or compromising in the image, you should know that the hook that we use to decrypt isn't a huge and crazy tool using arcane magic.
He said it. He said hook.
Yep. I sure did, Lelia. It's in the
What?
slide. Yep. Our developers would be able to use an automated process to encrypt their token and then use the encrypted string in their Buildkite pipeline configuration. So on our machines, we used an environment hook installed on the agents to call a decrypt.sh script and substitute environment variables as their unencrypted equivalent. So this script and a simple hack on our Buildkite agents allowed us to create a fully self-service and secure environment for our developers. Since read permissions are set by pipeline in Buildkite, you can put your token in the Buildkite pipeline config and then nobody else can read it. And this solution was an improvement over putting sensitive strings in a pipeline config, but we knew that we could make it even better. So we eventually made a more straightforward and shareable version. We built a HashiCorp Vault plugin and a set of hooks internally.
He said it again. Unbelievable.
Yep, I said hooks again, Lelia. I sure did. This will fetch plugins specified to a pipeline from the Vault API using a series of policies that we've configured for the purpose. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. This will fetch secrets specified to a pipeline from the Vault API, not plugins. So instead of any of the Buildkite pipelines having encrypted strings and then decrypting them on the machine, we have an authenticated session with Vault that exposes environment variables and files that we want to be available for a developer's pipeline. But what doesn't change between these experiences is that it's self-service and secure. So our security doesn't end with what developers can do. Sometimes we have to talk about what people cannot do. So we use this list to make sure that our environment
Ooh.
Are you upset? I'm talking about what people can't do. Peanut galleries notwithstanding.
Don't tell me what I can't do.
Okay. Peanut galleries notwithstanding. We use this list to make sure that our environment was only ever using repositories matching these strings. And the configuration available from Buildkite to only allow these plugins to run. So if no plugin is specified on certain agents, then we fail the job. And if they specify a pipeline that they can't use, it also fails. So this allowed us to have better control over more sensitive infrastructure, and we can restrict plugins to versions even, so that if we have a regression or we need to cut off a certain version, we can do that too. That creates more resilient infrastructure because we're standardizing the executions that happen on that environment. As we secured our execution environment and variables, we also had to standardize how people actually use the Docker executable. For example, when a user wanted to upload artifacts to reach our Artifactory instance from within Docker or GCP, GCS, whatever you use for container registries, there would be environment variables associated with it that the Buildkite agent needs to know about. So instead of having our users pass all of these environment variables manually, we would inject environment variables at run and create time. This small little script that you see kept us from having to create 5 to 6 lines of code in literally any pipeline step using Docker, or even worse, mounting them into containers using Docker. Imagine that upgrade path. That's easily thousands of configurations being saved by just doing this in the Docker run script instead, which is undoubtedly a win for developer experience and leverage and ease of use across the Wayfair. All of this, it should be noted, was accomplished more easily from the ins and outs that Buildkite provides through their pipeline definitions, their API, and the way that you can interact with their agent. Especially using plugins and hooks, we were able to
line and sinker.
Hooks, line, and sinker. Yep.
Mm-hmm. That's an original.
Yep, sure is. We were able to lock down container runtimes, restrict our sensitive execution environments, and secure sensitive tokens for Wayfair technologists. It's worth reflecting and praising Buildkite for this, especially at their own conference, for the work that they did that made this effort that much easier. So to continue the great things train about Buildkite, I want to go to Lelia for our last little story on how we build resilient communities.
Thanks, Gary. And it's true. This is our final tale. Back in the early days of Wayfair engineering, we invested pretty heavily in developing a cohesive monolith that could be shared and used by all. And this worked really great for a while since everything was self-contained and nobody had to worry about how it all worked under the hood. So it kind of made sense that in that monolithic world, we didn't need to have an incredibly well-paved path for building out net new, fully decoupled applications. That said, if you were one of those pioneering souls who really did need to start fresh, the end-to-end process for creating a new application from scratch would often take days, if not weeks. It required numerous tickets out to different teams with different SLAs, plus some micro expertise in everything from Puppet and Terraform to networking and storage tech. Needless to say, it was a lot for our engineers to deal with, especially newcomers who didn't yet know the intricacies of where to find this information or how to file these requests. Over time, creating a new application sort of developed a reputation for being time-consuming, confusing, and opaque. Worse yet, it likely incentivized many engineers to cling to our monolithic codebase, where they wouldn't have to worry about any of this stuff, rather than, step into the brave new world of microservices.
Microservices, microservices.
Please don't clap. Please don't. No. Thank you.
Sorry.
Moving on. We knew there had to be a better way, and thankfully, soon enough there was. What started out actually as a side project on our Python platform team, this humble CLI program called Mamba, eventually grew into one of the most widely used pieces of platform software at Wayfair. The beauty of Mamba lies in its serpentine simplicity and thoughtful accessibility. At its core, it's really just an interactive CLI tool which helps users make informed decisions about their new application, all while abstracting away the layers of tedium that our engineers once had to contend with. It quite literally reduces a process that used to take days, and maybe even some tears, down to mere minutes, and it ends with the instant dopamine hit of visiting your shiny new project on GitHub right away. Once you're there, a fully functional and dynamic Buildkite pipeline loaded with plugins awaits. And yes, even those pesky Kubernetes config files have already been scaffolded for you. Although Mamba originally only worked for Python apps, it actually gained so much popularity that other teams began contributing application templates for other languages and patterns. And the ecosystem continues to grow each day. Here, you'll see a short clip demonstrating one of the latest and greatest of such innovations, Mamba Hub, a really nifty plugin which allows engineers to view all projects generated by their team and even kick off new applications to be prepared by Mamba, all from the comforts of your browser. Under the hood, Mamba Hub leverages the power of Spotify's open source developer portal, Backstage, to marry the power of the Mamba CLI with the conveniences of a browser-based UI. Nowadays, it's pretty rare for me to stumble across a newly created service that doesn't use Mamba as its starting point. And honestly, that's not even the real power of embracing platforms that reduce friction and centralize complex logic. As it turns out, building tools to provide folks with a common framework and a shared understanding can also help create resilient communities of engineers who are infinitely better equipped to help stuck colleagues, collaborate across teams, or even share their ideas with the world through the power of open source. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our tales. But before we wrap up, let's quickly recap some of the themes that we explored throughout these anecdotes. We care about the user experience as it relates to developer leverage. We want our platform to be intuitive, impactful, and most importantly, fun to use. We prioritize code reusability so that we can unify similar workflows through a common framework and avoid duplicating efforts across teams. And lastly, we invest heavily in infrastructure resiliency. By providing a stable foundation for our engineers to build upon, we can earn their trust by letting them focus on the stuff they do really well, writing application code.
And that's the end of our talk. We really hope that you enjoyed it. I want to emphasize that none of these anecdotes would have come to life without dozens of dedicated Wayfair colleagues working together to make them happen. Some of the coolest stuff that we've accomplished was only possible because of how easy Buildkite makes it to integrate our custom functionality with their stable, easy-to-use platform.
Thanks, Buildkite.
Thanks, Buildkite. With that, I have been Gary White Jr.
I have been Lelia Bray-Musso.
Don't forget to check out our site featuring the OSPO projects currently incubating at Wayfair, and be sure to keep in touch using the GitHub and email links on the slide. Thank you so much for your time, UnblockConf. Come hang out with us over on Skittish, and we will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Bye.
Bye.